Welcome again to the Train the Trainer podcast. I'm Erik Hein, your host, and today I have another great guest, and I'm talking to Randy Wark. Is that correct pronouncement?
Perfect. Yep.
Yeah. And I sought out your biography, and you are a police training coordinator, a lead defensive tactics instructor, and a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt. I hope that's still correct.
It is.
And you have more than 16 years of experience in 2 states, currently assigned to the Cary Police Department Training Unit, where you are lead defensive tactics instructor, an in-service training coordinator, and field training officer program coordinator, and a former emergency response team leader. And you are adjunct instructor at Wake Tech Community Colleagues. Can I just ask you if this is correct? Just some questions from my Dutch colleagues about.
Sure, it is. So I'm not the FTO program coordinator anymore. That had recently just got transitioned to somebody else, but I was that for a few years. But everything else is spot on.
Correct.
So
because I think there is a little difference in police training between the Netherlands and your country. But what is in-service training? Is that for police cadets, or what is in-service training?
So in-service training basically is, so this is post-police academy. This is within the agency. Every year we have to do continued education training for our police. So that usually gets pushed down from the state. And that's the in-service training.
And is this how do you say it? In the Netherlands, they have to, the post academy, they come 4 times a year. And if they have special things like biking or motorcycle, or then they come extra times. Is there a how do you call it, a structural time that they come back to in service?
It's a little different per agency and per state within the U.S. Our in-service training is comprised of a lot of online training. There is some hands-on stuff like our firearms qualification, things of that nature, and then every now and then they'll mandate some defensive tactics training. But this is basically training that the state, our training standards and commission at the state level pushes out as a requirement for every law enforcement officer across the state of North Carolina where I work. So sometimes, like I said, it's comprised of online, and sometimes there's some physical training. And then this could also include department mandated training, which is usually where you see some of the things you're talking about. Like if the chief wanted officers to receive bike training or any type of hands-on training, that would typically be like a in-service through the department. So part of my role is to coordinate and host those efforts.
And what is the average training frequency for the police officer, for the average police officer? So the average training frequency for the average police officer?
I can confidently say not enough.
Yeah, I can also say,
like we could all say that.
Yeah.
But it varies from year to year. So you have to have, to meet the requirement of the state, which typically is about 12 hours worth of state mandated in-service training. It could be comprised of various topics, and the state changes it from year to year. We usually supplement that with some more training from the department. But like I said, the topics vary. So it could be de-escalation training, it could be domestic violence, it could be juvenile minority sensitivity training, ethics, firearms, defensive tactics, tactical medical. The topics vary each year.
And who decides what topic?
The state for the state mandated in service, and then the chief at the agency level.
Okay.
So it kind of varies from year to year, and we try as an agency to provide more training than most do. There's things that influence that, like manpower and staffing and special events and things of that nature, but we definitely try to provide ample opportunity for officers to get hands-on training, because the online training really, in my opinion, isn't the most effective modality in terms of improving performance.
Yeah. So here in the Netherlands, there is the 48 hours requirement, and it's mostly separated into 4 days. Uh, but of course, it would be better to spread it out more frequent and shorter. But the logistics are very hard.
Right.
Yeah, that's the point. But let's move on to the more great part. That is, why is grappling important for police officers? Why not doing Krav Maga, Systema, kickboxing, boxing, or whatever? I'm a little bit biased. I think you also, but why is grappling so important?
It's a great question, and it's one that I get often and I love talking about. And it's nothing against Krav Maga or Systema or kickboxing or Kali or Western boxing. It's nothing against those systems, and I've trained in all of those systems with the exception of Systema at some point in my martial arts career. It's just that when you look at the end user being a law enforcement officer and what the demands of the job entails, and you look at the statistics of use of force for police officers, a vast majority of them are going to comprise at some point in that engagement an element of grappling. You even take the simplest encounter where you have a compliant subject, they have a warrant for arrest, the officer moves forward to take him into custody. He has to put hands on. He has to enter into grappling range and put hands on. And that's the same for every single time that an officer has to take somebody into custody. There is always going to be an entrance into grappling range because that's where we handcuff.
Yeah.
And so with that, I feel like a lot of police academies teach to go hands-on, to move forward, to move into this grappling range. And if they encounter resistance, most academies teach take the subject or suspect to the ground in order to facilitate handcuffing. There's a conversation, a sidebar we can get to where they tend to take people into a prone position too soon, and we'll talk about that later. But grappling is inherent in what we do in law enforcement. And I've reviewed countless hours just within our agency of our body camera footage. We could all go on YouTube and do a search anytime, and you're going to see that grappling is ever present. And so with that, I feel like law enforcement officers need to be proficient with their grappling skills, the ability to manipulate somebody else's body using their own to limit mobility and control. That in and of itself is a very powerful de-escalator.
Yeah.
If you have officers that are not proficient in controlling somebody else against their will, then situations can escalate freely, all the way up to and including deadly force or escape or more violence. And what we see is that, and I'll steal a quote from Invictus, which is a really good training company over here and in Canada. The ineffective force has the appearance of excessive force. So if you have an officer that doesn't know what they're doing in close quarters combat and they're trying to take somebody into custody and they're losing control of the situation, that officer is more likely to resort to higher physical force means than somebody who's well trained in that domain. So to answer your question, grappling is present every single day in law enforcement, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
And our officers have to be proficient in subject control. Krav Maga is a solid system for self-defense for those very dangerous, high velocity, deadly force type situations. The problem is there's very little that addresses in their curriculum that addresses taking a subject into custody and overcoming resistance to get that job done. There's very little in other systems that address that. And I feel like arts like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Greco-Roman wrestling, freestyle wrestling, judo, similar systems to those address what we deal with in law enforcement on a day-to-day basis much more effectively and more directly than systems like the ones we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
You don't want an officer's first default to be kick him in the groin, chop him in the throat, punch him in the face. That doesn't want to be our default response. There is a time and place where those force multipliers may become necessary. But here's the thing that kills me about the criticism of grappling in law enforcement is people say, well, I can gouge your eyes out. I can grab your groin area. And it's like, we can do all those same things as grapplers. right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But we also have the added benefit of knowing how to use leverage and body weight and control to mitigate your mobility. And to me, that is the paramount skill. Now, here's the thing, and then I'll stop rambling. Jiu-jitsu is not the answer for law enforcement defensive tactics. And I love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, obviously. I've been doing it for a long time. I got my black belt about 2 years ago, and the journey has just begun. But every department, every agency has unique demands based on the people that work for them, the environment they operate in, right? And then even within that, your specialties have unique demands. And so really, jiu-jitsu is a piece of the answer for law enforcement defensive tactics, right? It might include a little bit of Muay Thai. It might include a little bit of Krav Maga. It might include a little bit of judo and wrestling. But the honestly, the answer for defensive tactics is a conglomeration of these different systems into what works for you, your agency, so on and so forth. So,
Yeah.
you know, I kind of, I don't like any system that wholeheartedly subscribes to just one modality to get the job done.
No, that's great. What, as I told you, we are both grapplers. I love grappling. I love crazy jiu-jitsu and so on. But why would people even question grappling as a good system for police officers? You told already, yeah, that oh yeah, they can eye gouge and that kind of thing. What are other criticisms? One criticism I can imagine, we had some discussions in the police training department when I was there, and that was that grappling is more than technique. It's like it's to say it very softly, it's proprioception, it's feeling the resistance and so on. And the question was always, we cannot teach officers in that short time, because you of course you can learn a lock or a takedown, but as you all know, that it takes, how do you call it, a lot of repetitions or training or good training to get a feeling, so to speak. I'm not sure if I'm asking a question or just ranting myself, but our officers, in the short time we have them, can they learn that grappling feeling? Maybe that's the what I'm asking.
I think, obviously, the longer you spend in grappling arts, the better you get at attuning to certain things within that realm. I think that this kind of connects to my other passion, which since the beginning of the year has been kind of the ecological approach and constraints-led approach. It kind of connects to that dialogue, because if we have limited time with our cops, we all know that. And we all know that we don't train as much as we probably should in an ideal world, especially in subject control. With that, it becomes very important to be efficient in the way that we train with the time that we do have. And what I've come to learn and realize, both through training and just experience in general, and this is even for jiu-jitsu players out there that may not even be strictly law enforcement jiu-jitsu players, is we're actually not best suited to spend a large majority of our time doing repetitious practice of grappling. Meaning, what I'm referring to when I say repetitious practice is kind of repetition without resistance or live energy. The dead repetition, dead reps, just over and over and over again against zero resistance. Your partner is just letting you work the technique over and over and over again. Now, I'm not saying that has zero value, because that would be ridiculous. I mean, we've been doing martial arts for thousands of years, and people have gotten really good using that method, right? There's arguments that can be made that most of that proficiency comes from the live practice, like rolling and sparring or positional sparring, but that's a debate that really can't be proven one way or the other. At the end of the day, I think with the law enforcement and with the limited time we have, we can develop more skills and proficiency and the ability to feel like you're saying and make good decisions by having our officers train in a more alive environment more often than we do dead repetition practice. You might have an officer do a few reps of a technique or a movement pattern just so that they feel what it feels like, but very quickly they should be put back into a live problem solving environment. And I would say it's probably better to introduce them to the problem first, let them experience it without the answer, and then provide them options after, and then put them back in that live environment with a few tweaks again. Because
Yeah.
the idea here is, like you said, yeah, there's definitely kinesthetic awareness that you develop in something like martial arts training. And kinesthetic awareness is faster, as far as your awareness and your ability to pick up on it as a human is faster than auditory or visual, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's great if we can develop those things, but the only way to develop that truly is by putting them in live environments or as close to live environments as you possibly can. And that's done using things like the constraints-led approach, where we can constrain the practice, right? The environment, the task, or the individual in
Yeah.
ways that we can get multiple touches on a specific area, but it's still working against resistance. Does that make sense?
Yes, makes a lot of sense. I also you triggered me also by what you said before about introducing the problem and so on, because I'm not sure. Are you aware of Straight Blast Jim Matt Thornton?
I've heard of it. I've
Yeah,
heard of it.
because he calls it. He has a whole theory about aliveness. He developed this 20 years ago, or maybe more, about aliveness. Aliveness in training is, if I remember correctly, it's about timing, motion, and energy. But more important or more interesting, he had a method he called the 3I method: introduce, isolate, integrate. I'm still using it sometimes. So introduce the problem, let them get a feeling and do some problem solving. Then isolate in the sense that, just showing showing some solutions to problems. Maybe you give, as a teacher, you give some hints or your own, and then integrate it into the whole game. So
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very, very similar stuff. And I mean,
yeah,
it's not like all or nothing. It's not like
no,
there's the way and then this is wrong. There's a scale
yeah,
to it. Uh, so I went to this class back at the beginning of the year. It was by Force Science, and it was called Methods of Instruction. And prior to that class, I was already kind of changing my practice at jiu-jitsu, changing the practice here in the department, and focusing more on concepts and principles and allowing people to come up with unique solutions on their own, because we're all different. We're built
hmm
different. We have different experience, different thought process. You know,
yeah,
you got people with engineers' brains, and you got people. It's so every human being is so amazingly unique that we can't all have the same solutions, right?
yeah,
And so I recognize that methods of instruction kind of poured gasoline on the fire for me, because they introduced me to the ecological dynamics and constraints-led approach. And then I took that and was like, man, this would be great for jiu-jitsu. And then lo and behold, I'm like way behind. There's already people doing that, you know. But it was great because then
yeah,
I listened to hours and hours of podcasts, read books, just nerded out in this
yeah,
method completely. And it made sense with what I was already doing.
yeah,
And so, you know, the instructors there, like Jeff Johnsgard and Chris Butler, they talked about this concept of turning the dials up and down.
mm,
So turning up dials on intensity or aliveness, turning down the dials on dead repetition, or vice versa, depending on what you're trying to achieve with that specific class or individual and what their needs are in that moment. So it's definitely not an all or nothing conversation, but it's just recognizing that most of the time we're better suited, more efficient to have a more alive environment than a less alive environment for
yeah,
the reasons you just brought up.
yeah,
And there's different ways to do that. And especially when you talk about firearms training
yeah,
versus defensive tactics versus any other motor skill that you're trying to develop. But I've just found that, you know, at the end of the day, we can all agree, if you think about it, that decision making and problem solving are the two most paramount skills that a law enforcement officer can have. I can give you, if I could just do the matrix on somebody and put the little headset on them and inject them with the needle, and it's like, I know Kung Fu, right? If I could do that with an officer, but they were terrible at making decisions critically, they couldn't read a situation, they couldn't make an appropriate decision.
Yeah.
Then what good are those skills? And so, you know, you want to have both, obviously. It's not, again, it's not an all or nothing conversation, but problem solving and decision making is definitely paramount.
Absolutely.
And so when you combine that with combative skills, shooting skills, whatever, now you have a very effective police officer who's probably not as likely to fall into the trap of emotion or excessive force or not enough force.
Yeah.
Because they're dialed into the environment and they're actively seeking solutions for the problems they're encountering. And they're not thinking internally about, oh, this is scary, or what was the technique that I was supposed to do for this situation, or you know, thinking about their master grip draw stroke for their firearm. No. They're fixated on what the problem is and they're solving that problem. And that's how we have to train.
Before we go into the constant led approach and maybe external focus of attention, just one thing I know, I was surprised by myself is that here in the Netherlands, we started with game-based approaches some 20 years ago, and maybe 10 years ago, well, and the constraint led approach and so on and so on. And I was heavily involved in that because I'm more a player than a, you know, like repetition guy. But to be honest, in 1993, when Hicks and Crazy came to the Netherlands and other Brazilians, it was very much technique based. But however, I was playing, and so on. But John Danaher surprised me because of his very technical approach. And I do not know what they do the rest of the training, but when I see Danaher coaching and training, it seems very precise. Also Gordon Ryan and the whole that like the angles and it looks a lot like the ideal technique. He even talks about John Danaher. For those who are not familiar with him, John Danaher is regarded as one of the prime jiu-jitsu instructors, I think, producing some of the best grapplers in the world, also working with George St. Pierre and so on. And he even said things like, you don't, in some way, like you don't need how do you call it, mental resilience. You just need good techniques because they will save you, and so on and so on. But from the outside, his approach looks very technical. Can you comment on that? Did you see that also, or am I wrong?
I don't think you're wrong. I think I've never trained with him. I wish I had that opportunity because, like you said, he's the man right now with coaching. But what I can say is, if you watch, there are several interviews out there, and then there's videos of their practice at their gym, and what you'll find is there is a lot of live training going on in their gym, and there are videos that you know, Gordon Ryan has alluded to things that sound similar to, maybe not the same thing, similar to the constraints-led approach being used in their practice. You know, they definitely do a lot of positional sparring. They definitely do a lot of live rolling. And you're talking about a gym that is the best grapplers in the world. And they're all in the same room, you know, and they're training live against each other and they're
many hours a day.
Oh yeah. So I mean the progress they're going to make. But here's the other thing that's really funny is if you watch an instructional for most, this is for most, not just Gordon Ryan or Danaher, but if you watch any instructional on BJJ Fanatics, for example, and you go and watch them in competition, the techniques that they teach you, they're going to do, but they're going to be done slightly or vastly different than the way they taught you in the instructional. And the reason for that, and I was just talking to a student yesterday at jiu-jitsu last night, is because if I go in there and take the easiest example possible, we're just teaching a S-mount armbar, right? Well, you teach your class this S-mount armbar, and you're going to show them very precise angles and good position and live toes in the back leg and trap the elbow and clear the arm and do this and this and this. But then when you roll, it doesn't look like that. It doesn't manifest the exact same way, because when we do the repetitious practice against no resistance, we're creating an environment, right? We're creating an ecosystem where those movement patterns are successful. But then when you put it in a roll, right, or a positional sparring round, and you induce resistance to it, all of a sudden you have to modify things in order to fit the ecosystem that you're operating in now, which is different than the one we did when we were doing our dead repetition practice.
Yeah.
So that's why, like, from a broad standpoint, doing a couple reps of something is going to kind of maybe introduce you to the broad idea of this movement pattern, but the solution is going to vary every single time. Like, I love the Kimura, love it,
Mm.
but it changes every single time I apply it when I roll,
Yeah.
every single time. And we could talk about the Kimura trap. You get down the rabbit hole of some of the meta stuff out there, and you got the arm saddle position that leads to a Kimura trap, that leads to a Choi bar. And it's like, yeah, those connections exist, but every one of those will be done slightly different depending on the person you're rolling against, their height, their weight, their defense mechanisms they use, the intensity you're rolling with, how you feel that day. It's always going to be different. And I think that's why we always have to make sure we have a high degree of aliveness in our training.
Yeah, great. I just wondered how the crazies did that. I'm not sure how they the crazy university, for example, seems on the one hand very precise, but on the other hand they have a lot of games also. So I
They
think,
do.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. They
So
do.
let's go back to the constraint-led approach and how to apply it to make it more difficult. The constraint-led approach apply to jiu-jitsu, apply to police training.
Yep.
And maybe I don't think all trainers know what a constraint-led approach is. So maybe you can give just your your vision about it, how you interpreted it, and what it means for the training.
Sure. And full disclosure on this, I'm definitely not a PhD or you know, I would encourage everybody to do their due diligence and research, because much like you just said, I think that you worded it well. My interpretation of it
Yeah.
is going to be different than some other people's, and that's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
As long as we're turning up, manipulating those dials accordingly, you're going to see more success. So the constraints-led approach is essentially underpinned by ecological dynamics. Ecological dynamics is basically, and I'm not going to, the nerds, the eggheads are
No,
going to
no,
flip out.
just for trainers. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
ecological dynamics, from a very, 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 very fundamental standpoint, very shallow standpoint, is essentially a theory about how we interact with the environment as human beings. Basically, it says that there's a relationship that exists between the environment and the individual, right? So I perceive whatever I'm perceiving. So we're talking about jujitsu. I perceive, I'm rolling with you. I pass your guard. I get into side control, right? Those actions are carried out because of my relationship with the environment that you and I are operating in. And I see an opportunity, AKA an affordance, to pass your guard because of something that you did. Maybe you stacked your hips in one way and I was able to staple your leg down and get past your legs and get into side control. So there's a relationship between the person and the environment, and it goes two ways. So I may move, and then the environment reacts to what I do, and then because I moved, it creates new affordances or opportunities for action. And so there's a good relationship there. So the constraints-led approach is underpinned by ecological dynamics, and like I said, that I would encourage you, other people, the listeners, to read into that a little bit, because it's a shift from what we typically think of in the traditional approach, where it's like very much informational processing. Like, you feed me information, I take it, and then I scroll through my Rolodex when I'm in that situation and pick the right option.
Mm.
Right? It's a different way of looking at and perceiving how we learn. The constraints-led approach is a method of including things in there, or occluding things in there, to manipulate this relationship so that I learn how to problem solve in real time. So the constraints-led approach, you apply constraints, which we typically think of as like limitations, but it could be giving options too, right? It's both ways. I could take away, I can add to, but it's manipulating the space that I'm training in, and turning up and down the dials on aliveness so that I can get touches, what they call repetition without repetition, on a particular aspect of law enforcement or jiu-jitsu. So a prime example of this would be, let's say I've got two students, they're relatively new, right? They could be law enforcement officers, it doesn't matter. And I say, okay, partner A, you're going to be flat on your back. Partner B, you're going to cover partner A's hips with your hips. So you're going into what we would call like a mount position, just generically. And partner B, you're going to have what we call underhooks. So you're going to control underneath like the armpits of partner A. Stay heavy chest to chest pressure as much as you can. Your job on top is just to maintain top position any way you can. I don't care. You don't have to stay covering the hips, right? But I want you to start there, and I want you to maintain chest to chest pressure and stay on top any way you can, right? The bottom partner, I want you to either make the top player the bottom player, so get yourself on top of them, get your feet in between you and them, or stand back up to your feet. If the bottom player is able to achieve any of those objectives, they win, and then we'll reverse roles. Top player becomes bottom player and do it again. And in this game, what you're doing is you're giving them a lot of repetition without repetition on top player controlling somebody, which is paramount for law enforcement to be able to establish a dominant position and maintain it, right? In order to fatigue the bottom player and maybe eventually get them into handcuffs or wait for a check-in to show up or one of those things to occur. Bottom players getting really good touches on, very basic fundamental defense and trying to maybe either regard or stand to their feet. And you can even change that to be more restrictive to bottom player if you really want to work on top players' control. You can just say, hey, bottom player, all I want you to do is just push away with your hands and try to get out from underneath top player, right? And you can kind of like stack the deck in favor of one or the other, depending on what you're trying to develop. And what this does, that's a prime example of the constraints-led approach in grappling, is I'm constraining the tasks, the task focus for bottom player and top player. But they're working against live resistance. And so and I'm giving them a pretty strong control position. And then what you could do is in game number 2, after they play that game for, time is another whole conversation, but anywhere from 3 to 6 minutes, depending on skill and conditioning. At the end of that game, you bring them back to it and you say, okay, now top player, I want you to start out covering their hips again, but now you're just going to be postured up. You don't have the underhooks anymore. And I want you to stay on top any way you can. Bottom player conditions are the same. And what'll happen most often with new players or new students, what'll happen is they immediately get rolled over, or immediately the guy escapes his feet, stands back up, and they're like, what happened? Hey, keep going. Let's keep going. Keep working. You're giving them a chance to problem solve. And then what they'll find is, man, I had a lot more control when I had these underhooks. I had a lot more control when I had chest to chest pressure, when I controlled the hips. And so they're self-organizing in this environment. And it's a more efficient and more sticky way of developing those skill sets. And so that's like a very fundamental, shallow dip into the constraints-led approach. But there are so many ways to use it. You could constrain the environment. So I could reduce lighting. I could turn up noise. I could have role players that are standing around and making a bunch of chaos and taking pictures and videoing. We could make, we could put obstacles in their furniture and things like that to make the environment more realistic and more conducive to what an officer would have. You could fatigue the individual, so they're coming in pretty fatigued and they have to work through those things, right? Yeah. Which, sidebar, I don't think is really truly replicating stress. You're inducing pressure, but stress is something different because we all respond different to it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense, but I would love to hear your take on it. I agree with you, but why do you say that physical? I'm not sure if that's what you say, but physical fatigue is not the same as stress. It seems that you are saying. Can you just elaborate on that? What do you mean by that?
Sure. So, and we do it all the time still here, where, before a course of fire on the range, or, before a round of grappling, we might have somebody do some light calisthenics and get their heart rate up. But the purpose behind it is different than what it used to be. I used to think that was replicating the stress an officer might be under if they had to enter a building and clear it and encounter resistance. It's not the same. No. Your heart rate does tend to increase when under stress, but there's still other things happening within the body. And so you can create pressure, right? You can create pressure through task constraints, through noise in the environment, through increasing their heart rate via exercise. That's pressure. But stress is something unique to the individual, right? You and I stay physically active all the time. So I'm comfortable at heart rates that are 170, 180 beats per minute. I'm still functioning and making logical decisions at a heart rate of that level. And I know that because I track my heart rate while I do jiu-jitsu and I see what elevated levels I'm getting into. But having been involved in deadly force encounters in law enforcement, it is totally different the way that your brain reacts and perceives under that type of stress. And so it's not exactly the same.
No.
Doesn't mean it's worthless, but we as trainers have to understand that that's not exactly the same thing. And then if you take somebody, here's the thing, you take you or me and you say, hey, I'm going to have you do a minute of burpees before you come into this room and run this thing. Okay. Yeah, my heart rate's going to be up. I'll be breathing a little heavier, but mentally I'm calm. Emotionally I'm calm. No big deal, right? But you take an officer who doesn't exercise, that's self-conscious of their body and their performance, and they don't like force on force scenarios to begin with. And now you make them do a minute of burpees and come in there, you're going to see a different physiological response in that room.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so that's what I was kind of referring to.
It's great.
Referring to pressure and stress and using it the right way. Yeah.
We now in the Netherlands also use the term stress more precise because, well, what is stress? It can be anger, it can be fear. I remember my first Kyokushin karate tournament as a youngster. Kyokushin karate was a full contact karate style back then, and I had my first, and I was a young boy, a young man of 20 years, great condition, and so on and so on. But I walked to the mat, and all my energy was just drowning into my legs. Yeah, it was. I just I didn't hear my coach anymore. There were such strange things happening, and I can imagine, and of course on the streets it's the same.
100% it is, and that's something we see.
Yeah.
And I think that's another reason why the constraints-led approach and ecological dynamics work so well for police, is because it has a tendency, it has a potential at least, to reduce individual stress in the moment because you've experienced something intense and similar before. You're going to have stress still because of the gravity of the situation. If I'm fighting somebody over a knife, of course, there's a stress, a physiological response, a fear, because the stakes are higher than in the training room.
Yeah.
But if I have played games around that before, at least it's not completely novel to me.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing about it. And now that's completely anecdotal. I don't have any scientific research to back that, but just from my experience, I think that, and we talk about jiu-jitsu, we spend so many hours on the mat grappling against somebody else, imposing our will against somebody, trying to impose their will against us, that when you get into a scuffle on the road as a police officer, it is still stressful. It will always be stressful,
of course.
But it has less impact physiologically than it would if I never trained in grappling before, had never felt that type of pressure.
I even found, because of my own martial arts training, that using physical force in police situation didn't, it felt like, not precisely, but you could use it clinically. I was not afraid of. That's also a thing. I was not afraid of using force myself because it was not based on fear. It was based on doing this every day in the gym, and
it is. And then I think a lot of times we surprise ourselves how simple it is on the road in comparison to in the dojo, right?
Yeah.
Because we're going against somebody in the gym that is trained and knows how to counter what we're doing. They have real skills.
Yeah.
And more often than not all the time, and you don't want to be complacent, but more often than not, when you try to do a takedown out on the road or you get somebody on the ground, and you're talking very fundamental jiu-jitsu or grappling skills that are required. You don't have to go into that third, fourth layer of your game out there. So
true. Talking about jiu-jitsu and stress, and we have to go back, of course, to the constant approach, but one thing, I was developing a new course called Scan and Breed, and also writing articles. And of course, I went back to Hickson Crazy. I bought his book, Breed, and so on. And he placed a lot of emphasis on breathing, even breathing during rolling and so on. do you use breathing techniques? In some Brazilian training and trainers, they use it a lot. Like I mean, with breathing, I mean very, like very consciously using breathing techniques like pursed lip breathing and so on. But what about breathing and jiu-jitsu and stress?
So I mean, I've heard some of the different methods that exist out there. I think the number one step is recognizing when you're not breathing.
Yeah.
When you've got officers that are in scenarios, or new jiu-jitsu students that are rolling, and they're putting forth a lot of effort, they'll have a tendency to hold their breath, and then they'll wonder why their gas tank depletes so quickly. So the number one step is being aware of your breath. Number one, that's huge. That's a big step in the right direction. Number one.
Yeah.
And I learned that because I used to be very claustrophobic, like to the point where I actually got discharged from the military early in my career because of my claustrophobia being so severe. So jujitsu, of course, puts you into a lot of potentially claustrophobic positions. And I had to learn to be keenly aware of my breath, and learning that sometimes you got to belly breathe, sometimes you got to chest breathe in jiu-jitsu. And even just being aware of, I have pressure on my chest, let me breathe through my belly. I have pressure on my belly, let me breathe through my chest, was a big step in the right direction toward addressing claustrophobia. Now, in terms of, I don't do breathing techniques like the ones you're referring to from Hicks and Gracie while I roll. But one thing I do intentionally focus on, especially in law enforcement and when I was on the tactical unit, is in those moments where you have seconds to actually control your breathing, like maybe before entry on an operation or on the way to a hot call. I would use, the box breathing is real popular, but I actually prefer what's called a physiological sigh. Have you heard about that? Or a
Yeah,
cyclical
I
sigh?
talked with Melis Balban also. Yeah.
And I think that that's a very powerful technique.
Yeah.
So breathing in deeply, sharply through the nose, in through the mouth, and then out through the mouth. Slow, steady exhale does wonders.
Yeah.
Because what I found with box breathing, and you could change the count, it doesn't have to be 4-4-4-4. You can change that however you want. What I found is if I tried to stick to the 4 and I was already in a state of being a little bit stressed, it would actually make me feel worse.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So that's kind of my take on breathing. Breathing is obviously essential,
Yeah.
and I know like Wim Hof has a breathing method that helps him regulate body temperature and stress, and there's obviously power there. But I think the number one thing is just being aware of when you aren't breathing or holding your breath.
That's great. I recently interviewed Judith Anderson, and she is a police researcher from Toronto. And she developed a breathing protocols for police and for police training. And she is the first one who really tested it in real high intensity police scenario trainings with lethal force. And she developed what is called the reset breath and the recovery breath. That was a very an eye-opening study, and she also summarized it into her paper. It's great, and they use it. They really use it into what you are now saying, like before you step into the door, do a reset breath or do some very practical breaths. Yeah, it's great.
Well, and that connects really good to something else you were saying you want to talk about, which is like the external internal focus of attention. Because if you have that moment to essentially you're detaching, right? You're taking a step back, taking that split second to address your breathing. That's basically opening you up and making you more external again.
Yeah.
At least in my opinion, I think that's a very powerful thing, because if I'm so focused internally on what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, what I should be doing, what could happen, the doomsday thinking, I'm not going to be very effective when that door opens and I step in and have to address. I need to be open. And we all know that stress has a tendency to close in. There's times when you want to have a narrow focus of attention. Externally still, but external narrow. But I want to be focused in the right area. If there's a deadly threat, I want to be obviously external narrow, focused on my deadly threat. And then as soon as I address that, I need to be able to open back up again. And being able to go back and forth, that takes time and skill and practice and breathing to make that happen. So
that's great. I still use Nieder's quadrant, like with the internal broad, internal small, and so on. And Dr. Bill Lewinsky even told me that Nieder himself was an Aikido practitioner, and And you move around the box all the time, of
all the
course,
time.
because that's another part of policing is also, isn't it? It's not only emerging in the moment. Sometimes you have to make some plans, some tactics. You have to, I'm not sure how to share that in English, but the commander has to say, we are now here. This is the shared mental model, and now we're going further on this and this and that. So there is also the, inside, outside, external, internal. It's all you have to,
100%. Yeah, for
attention.
sure. You have to, and being able to manipulate that.
Yeah.
Again, that's a skill in and of itself, for sure.
You also, I saw you talking about attention training, or maybe you called it attention control training.
Attentional control. Yep.
Yeah, what do you mean by that, and how is it related to, for example, grappling and constraint that?
So what we were doing that with that attentional control is essentially what we were just talking about, is being able to read the environment and focus your attention where it needs to be focused. And that we're using the quadrants, being able to shift from external narrow to external broad when needed, even potentially internal if that's needed, less often than external in a performance environment. But what we were using to address that was we were doing a drill in our agency where we would bring officers in one by one. We were using CERT pistols. Are you familiar with CERT pistols?
No, but
It's like,
yeah.
so it's like a red gun, and I'm trying to see if I got one with me right now. I can, yeah. So it's a red training gun.
Oh yeah. We have
And
them also.
it shoots like a laser, right? Nothing, the slide doesn't operate, none of that. So, but there's a laser that comes out. And so we used that, and essentially the bad guy role player had one, and the officer entering the scenario had one. And basically they were given very limited information. The officer would enter the room, and there would be a subject facing away for some reps, facing them for others, facing sideways for others. But they would enter and they would see the subject. As soon as they addressed the subject, they would have to respond to the stimulus provided. That was pretty much all the instruction that was given to the officer. Very limited information. Each scenario lasted about 20 seconds. They would come in. Sometimes the officer would, reach and pull out a cell phone. Sometimes they would reach, draw the gun, and point it at them. We would change the responses every single time. Sometimes the subject would be facing away. They'd have to turn, draw, point. Sometimes they'd be facing them already with their shirt concealing the weapon. They would pull their shirt up and then draw and present. Different manifestations of draws, different things would happen. And then what we would do is a few reps in, because the officer would run through about 4 iterations of this, the same officer. And what we would do is we would take yellow tape, and we'd put yellow tape on the elbows of the role player suspect. And we would just give the officer an instruction on that rep. We'd say, I want you to focus your attention on the yellow tape and track the yellow tape with your eyes this time. That's all I'm giving you. And they would come in, and then we would have them do a rep with the yellow tape. They would take the tape away. We'd say, okay, go back in there and deal with the situation as you would. And what we noticed was when they learned that the elbow flares on draw presentations, right? Once they learned that, and they were able to actually focus their attention where information was important, they were able to make faster decisions. We tracked it with our camera, and it was actually 50. We cut their response time in half.
Wow.
And like I said, now some of that is them gaming the game and knowing that something is up because they've gone through a couple of revolutions. But like I said, we would change. Sometimes there was no weapon presentation. Sometimes there was. Sometimes it was sideways, backward. You know what I mean? We changed everything. Yeah. So there's only so much gaming they can do.
Yeah.
And what we noticed then also, we'd ask questions. We'd say, hey, if you could go back and do that exact scenario again, what would you do differently? And a lot of them would say, well, I'd move. Well, how would you move? I would move off the X. Well, what does that mean to you? I would move laterally. Okay, cool. Well, in the next coming iterations, maybe just consider that as an option.
Yeah.
And because they were able to see the elbow move, it gave them the ability to close some of that reactionary gap. Yeah. And be able to step off the X, draw their gun, and actually get laser rounds on target before they were shot. Whereas the earlier reps, they were getting beat to the punch every single time. Yeah. And so then we would, at the end, we would debrief and we'd say, the reason why we did this is because we're trying to teach you that there are certain areas that are very important to focus your attention on in a given scenario. And there's other areas that are worthless information we don't need to worry about right now. Because a lot of officers would focus at first on like their eyes and their face, and they stay fixated there. Or they'd be looking around at, and I get it. Come in external broad, scan the environment, but then now here's your focus of attention. And now there should be a systematic scan of the body as you're talking to them, picking up on pre-assault indicators or anything that might clue you toward a threat. And it might not be a gun. It might be the bag of cocaine they're throwing away. You know, the cell phone. What we noticed about cell phone that they were able to pick up on was there was a different speed and violence of action with which I produce a cell phone versus a weapon when I'm trying to shoot you. So you still get the same elbow flare, but there's not as much dynamic action to it. And so it's less threatening.
Yeah.
Sometimes they would still reach back for their gun, and that's fine. You think about it in the context of law enforcement. If somebody, you know, you're talking to someone, all of a sudden that hand disappears, you probably should have some kind of reaction to it. Because we know that physiologically we're not capable of overcoming that time that we lost already when they acted and we're reacting to it.
Yeah.
And so that's what I was referring to with attentional control training is training officers how to and where to focus attention to gather the important information to make sound decisions.
And does this also works beyond sorry, that's not the correct word, but beyond firearms training? So can the education of attention, works it also in subject control, like certain positions or movements? It reminds me of Tony Blauer, his pre-contact.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm a huge proponent of body language and pre-assault indicators. I think officers should study those things just like anything else. I used to teach a class on it that I developed early on in my instructor career because I had an experience where pre-assault indicators, I feel like, saved my life. So I'm very big on that, and I think that's where it would connect to subject control, is teaching them these pre-assault indicators, because you have to know when to close distance, when to create it. And you could definitely come up with ways to include kinesthetic awareness into that attentional control training as well. You know, maybe incorporating blindfolds and starting them off with a degree of contact, and then the suspect moves and they have to be able to track that movement, you know.
Are you still teaching that class?
Occasionally, on a need-to basis, but it was just called pre-assault indicators. Pretty simple, but it definitely helped me a lot with a subject that had a gun. And I noticed the flare and was able to address the situation and survive it. So between jiu-jitsu and pre-assault indicators, you know, that was paramount. So
great. If we move back to grappling and or jiu-jitsu, because it's one way how to teach. You're using a teaching method like the constant-led approach, but also important, I think, is what to teach. So, for example, when I was working here in the Netherlands with police teams, also because of the short time I had, but I put a lot of emphasis on, let's say, anti-ground techniques. It's a strange English, but how, you know, like anti-takedown techniques. So to keep standing on your feet. Of course, also lying on the ground and so forth, but giving a limited time, what should be in the... Also, a great anecdote maybe, when I was first doing grappling kind of stuff with a SWAT team, I also tried to, you know, like to learn them how to go to the ground, like if they were kicked or punched and they would fall to the ground and so on. But we had those heavy armored vests, and well, there were a lot of, and of course your weapon on your holster and so on. So it was not as easy as I had imagined.
Right.
So some things are maybe more easy to do with grappling. But coming back to the question, what are the necessary requirements for a grappling curriculum? Let's say, what are the it's not a techniques, because then we're going back to techniques, but what are the contents of grappling?
So let me make sure I understand the question. So you're talking about jiu-jitsu and how do I incorporate constraints-led approach into jiu-jitsu practice?
No, I mean, I know you are teaching aliveness using constraint led approach and so on. But now the question becomes, what do you teach? I mean, is it ground control? Is it anti-takedown techniques? Is it takedown techniques? Is it everything?
In the context of law enforcement?
In the context of law enforcement, yes. Using the guard, no guard.
I try to play as much of the whole game as I can, to be honest with you. And you know, I'll connect that to the tactical part in a minute, because that kind of changes it a little bit. So we'll do games that kind of cover it all. I think some of the more important concepts that we need to make sure we touch on are hand fighting, inside position, top control, and escaping bottom, right?
Yeah.
I don't really spend very much time at all, if any, on submissions.
Okay.
because for me, law enforcement, we're not worried about submissions. This is not a grappling tournament. If I use something like a Kimura as a law enforcement officer, it's probably in a weapon retention perspective, and it's probably going to lead to a break. There is no submission, right? So I focus more on positional control, positional escape, takedowns, and hand fighting or grip fighting.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, strike defense plays a role in that as well. So distance management, key concept, inside position, key concept. Those are the things we tend to focus most of our efforts on in defensive tactics when we play these games. So we'll start out, they'll do hand fighting to win inside position, to close distance or control distance, right? Then that connects to takedowns, off balancing. So we'll play games around, okay, I've established a connection. It might be a body lock or head and arm control or 2-on-1, whatever connection I got to. Now your job is to off balance that person, put them on the ground. Then we'll play some games there. Then we'll play some games around ground control, staying on top for as long as you can. Then we'll play some games around, you're the one on bottom. You fell or got taken down by a suspect. You need to get back to your feet. And we'll play games around that.
Yeah.
So that's a typical kind of structure. And of course, then you can implement them wearing their duty gear, weapon retention, wall pins. So wall pins are very similar to top control or bottom escape. It's just that the wall becomes your new floor, essentially. So we'll play games where an officer has a suspect pinned against the wall and they have to maintain that pin, or the officer's pinned against the wall and they have to escape that pin.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the typical structure. And typically we'll have maybe 2 hours or so to work with officers on this. So we have time to get through the entire game of grappling. Very similar to how I would teach my jiu-jitsu practice. Play the whole game of jiu-jitsu as often as we can through these games and then roll at the end. Yeah. We won't typically roll with officers though, unless they have background. So yeah. When it connects to the tactical side, it changes because the demands of it are, you got full gear, right? Tack gear. That's an environmental constraint in and of itself. So we have to factor that into the game. So we'll play the whole game of jiu-jitsu or the whole game of grappling as much as we can with the operators, but then it's going to be with a team of 3 or in a room with wall pins. Or you have the subject on the ground and you're working them on the ground, and then a check-in, your team member is able to collapse their sector and move in to assist. So the most important thing is it's broad, it's alive, it's addressing the different degrees of combat, but that it's also related to and as realistic as possible to what their end demands are. So you have to cater it to, are we talking about traffic officers, patrol officers, SWAT guys, SROs? You can modify some of these things to fit the end user. So,
do you also grapple with full gear on?
Yes.
Okay.
Some occasionally, yes.
Yeah.
It's the dials again. It's turning one up, turning one down, depending on what you're trying to achieve. But it is good to work with full gear if you can.
There is one famous submission which became famous in the Netherlands, not because of good outcomes, but it is of course the I'm not sure how you call it, but it's the vascular neck restraint. Because there was a situation here many years ago, when a subject died because of this technique, and I think from then on it was forbidden. However, in most real fights on the streets, cops also go to the how do you call it, to the head and so on. And what is your point of view? How do you do that in the States? Is it legal? Can you do it in training or?
It varies from agency to agency, state to state to some degree, although the vast majority, the vascular neck restraint or strangulations are limited to deadly force only.
Uh-huh.
But again, that could still change. From what I understand, there's agencies out there that say you can't do it ever, which is kind of crazy to me because if I'm in a deadly force situation,
Yeah.
all bets are off, you know. So as a result, we don't train choke strangulations, vascular neck restraints very often. If we do, it's from the perspective of defense. And so we may teach proper technique so that an officer can practice it safely. My personal opinion is that it shouldn't be as taboo as it is. I feel like, you know, you look at any tool that we're given in law enforcement, take the taser as a prime example. A taser can be deadly force if in the wrong hands or used inappropriately. The choke is no different. So if we have officers that are trained in the proper execution of, just like they are with taser, baton, pepper spray, strikes, any other technique or tool, if officers are trained to use it correctly, you talk about a very effective way to de-escalate very volatile situations. Everybody's natural human instinct is to protect their airway. So if I were to slap a choke on, even if I'm not even really hell-bent on putting you unconscious, but I just threaten the strangulation, most people, their hands are going to come up in defense of their neck. And now I've gained access to your hands. They're not reaching for a gun. They're not reaching for my gun. They're not reaching for a knife. They're not striking me in the face. They're protecting their airway. And so I think that the reason why strangulations are so taboo is because the people that are in the positions of making these decisions aren't trained. We teach kids to do vascular neck restraints every single day, and they roll live with it. And nobody's dying from that. And I've been choked millions of times. I know you have. So it's kind of a fallacy that they think that way. And I think it comes from a place of ignorance, to be completely honest. I understand perception, and I know that's always going to have a place in law enforcement, but it comes down to training and proficiency. So that's kind of my opinion on it.
You seem very enthusiastic about grappling and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. What is your background with regard to? Are you more a grappler or a jiu-jitsu or both? And do you standing you in some kind of tradition?
Well, I've been doing martial arts my whole life, since about 12 years old. And I started actually in striking arts. So I started in boxing and Muay Thai.
Oh, yeah.
And I still love that stuff. I don't train it as much as I wish I could because I'm spending so much time doing jiu-jitsu and teaching now. But so as far as grappling, I did a little bit of Keto when I was younger. Not as keen on that as I used to be, but the last 16 years of my training has been heavily focused in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Here lately, the past maybe 3-4 years, wrestling has definitely become a staple in my training. We've got really good wrestlers at our gym. And I think that the synergy between jiu-jitsu and wrestling is powerful. And so I think that's kind of where my system has kind of leaned for the past few years.
Do you also train with the gi?
Yes. I do more no gi these days than gi, but I still incorporate gi. Mostly because I just love jiu-jitsu. That doesn't, in my opinion, that's not for any law enforcement purpose. I tend, and everybody's entitled to their opinions, but I tend to feel that no gi is more effective in terms of retention and transfer for law enforcement because I don't want to rely on a piece of clothing to get the job done. I want to know how to manipulate another body using my body and not have to worry about cloth in between because you're wearing a t-shirt right now. If I were to grapple you and try to rely on that t-shirt, it's going to rip, it's going to stretch. We know that sometimes a pre-assault indicator is somebody disrobing. So if they strip that top layer of clothing, I don't have that to manipulate. And so I tend to lean more toward no gi for self-defense, for law enforcement application. Do people wear jackets with heavy collars? And could you potentially manipulate those like you do a gi? Yes. And that's still an option. I think that comes back on when we talk about external focus of attention and all the affordances and all of that. That's why training alive and being keyed into your environment is so important. So you can recognize these opportunities for action. but I tend to lean more toward no gi, probably 3-1, honestly.
Yeah.
No gi over gi.
So, to be cautious of your time, of course, how do police officers experience this kind of constraint-led approach training with grappling? What do they enjoy it? Do they like it?
I feel like they do. My coworker and I, we work together in the training unit. We both feel like, for the most part, you have the exceptions, but they're always going to exist. But I feel like officers enjoy the live environment more. They all dread it coming in, but once they get into the training, they tend to be more bought in. And I feel like we get more effective training time. Now, sometimes some groups and some officers are more motivated and inspired than others, and we have to provide that inspiration externally and get them going. But for the most part, we see that officers have more fun with it. And then in my jiu-jitsu practice, the students definitely love it. My Friday class has grown tremendously since I started incorporating constraints-led approach into it. And at the end of class, sometimes guys will have questions on techniques, and I'll still address those. Because like I said, it's not an all or nothing conversation. It's just, I think we need to have more of one than the other. But we definitely, I enjoy it more myself. I love it. And the last thing I'll say on that is, if you train at a gym that doesn't use constraints-led approach or play these games, you can still incorporate some of the benefit by constraining yourself when you roll. I think one of the big things about jiu-jitsu that we need to improve on is being better training partners, because if a student were to say, hey, I really just want to work on my guard retention, can we just focus on you trying to pass my guard and me trying to retain it? If you pass my guard, then we'll just reset.
Yeah.
Not even worry about submissions. That would be a good example of a constraint being applied to the task. And so now you're getting all these touches on guard retention, versus if we just roll and I pass your guard and I don't ever let you have it back again, you only got one rep on your guard retention.
Yeah.
So that's a way that students, listeners can incorporate that into their own practice if they're not doing it at their gym. If they're high enough ranked, see if you can create a class where you can start creating it. And you learn a lot more teaching it too. So
Yeah, absolutely. What are your inspirations or ambitions for the future of, let's say, the coming 5 years with regard to this method of teaching and grappling with police?
So I've already got a class that I'm offering at a local community college. I'm probably going to change the name. You learn by doing. You learn ecological dynamics ecologically. So I'm probably going to change the name, because I think a lot of officers don't know what the hell ecological dynamics is.
Do you have a
so
suggestion?
I'm leaning toward adaptive control, adaptive subject control, or something like that.
Yeah.
But my hopes are to continue to create classes like this. I'd like to branch out and teach more abroad as well, and maybe do some training consulting a little bit, and then eventually have my own company teaching civilians some stuff too, some survival skills.
Wow.
Those are some of my aspirations. My dream would be to publish a book, but I don't know what I'm going to write about. So I got to figure that out first. But that's kind of where I'm looking. So.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. Did I forget to ask you something about
No,
topics?
I don't think so. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come on. This is cool.
Yeah,
So.
it's great. You do a good job in make me very enthusiastic about what you're doing, and it's great. So thank you. Oh, by the way, are there any good resources you would point out, trainers and even jiu-jitsuka too?
Yeah, I would say Perception Action podcast, Dr. Rob Gray's podcast. Look up Greg Souders. He tends to rub some people the wrong way a little bit, but you gotta understand it's just his personality. I mean, the guy gives away information for free, so obviously he's passionate and knows what he's talking about. So if you're jiu-jitsu, Greg Souders has a lot of great examples of games you can run and videos talking about this approach. There's a constraints-led approach book. It's literally called the Constraints-Led Approach.
I think I've also here. I have two books from Rob Gray. I cannot find him. Yeah,
and he's got 2 books out, a third one coming out. So anything by Dr. Rob Gray would be fantastic. Ecological Dynamics Submission Grappling is a Discord channel. So if you can get on there, there's countless information, resources on there. Those, and then what is it called? Emergent. Is that what they're called? There's a company, I think they're called Emergent. emergence. They do athletic development using the constraints-led approach.
Yeah.
But
And
it's
with regard to jiu-jitsu, do you have also some inspiring resources like
I think that honestly, the ecological dynamics for submission grappling is a huge one. If anybody needs an invite, because it's a Discord, just hit me up on LinkedIn or whatever, and I can send you an invite to it. But that's a great resource. They have a resource channel on there, which has podcast episodes, books, magazine articles, videos.
Wow.
And then again, I would say check out Greg Souders. I know I'm leaving out a bunch of people that they could look up, but there's Josh Beam. If you go on YouTube, he's a jiu-jitsu practitioner that heavily enforces this. School of Grappling is another channel on YouTube.
Yeah.
They're not 100% subscribed to CLA or ecological dynamics. They're just all about learning effectively, but there are certainly components of that on there as well. So those would be some resources I'd push people toward for jiu-jitsu.
For outsiders like me living here in the Netherlands, I have always the impression that the crazy combatives is also a big player in the States, but I'm not sure if it's correct.
What was it again?
The crazy combatives of law enforcement.
It can be pretty. So I won't disparage any person that's trying to better law enforcement subject control tactics. But the Gracies have a good system. I just think that again, it comes back on catering what you need to your end user. So there may be options and things that they teach that are a good fit for you. Use those, but it doesn't have to be a subscription to that entire system and nothing else.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Well, thank you so much again, and I hope talking again to you, and I will keep following you, and I will end this podcast and say goodbye to you. So
Sure.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time.